The night Daniel called her his backup plan, Owen realized he had been calling her something else for 3 years. He had just never said it out loud before. Owen Calloway was 38 years old, a furniture restorer who worked out of a converted garage on Meridian Street where the smell of linseed oil and old cedar had permanently settled into the walls. He was divorced, not bitterly, not dramatically, the kind of divorce that ends the way a long sentence ends, with a period rather than an exclamation mark. His ex-wife had remarried someone with a more predictable schedule, and Owen had learned that his idea of a good Tuesday evening, radio low, sandpaper in his hand, a beer going warm on the workbench, was not everyone's idea of the same thing. He was not actively looking for change. He was, at most, quietly aware that something was missing the way you are quietly aware of a draft in a room. Not cold enough to act on, just present enough to notice. Claire had been part of his life for the last 3 years, the way the radio was part of his garage, always on, always there, so familiar that he had stopped hearing how much he depended on it until the room went quiet. She had walked into his life through the side door of a mutual friend's backyard barbecue on a warm August evening, holding a paper plate in one hand and wearing paint on the cuff of her left sleeve that she would later tell him she had been trying to get out for 2 weeks. She was 35, a graphic designer who freelanced from her kitchen table and occasionally panicked about deadlines at 11 in the evening, in text messages that Owen had come to think of as part of his natural weather system. She had been post-broken engagement when they met. Not fragile, not performing recovery, just genuinely in the middle of figuring out what her own life looked like without someone else's preferences mapped over it. They had talked for 4 hours at that barbecue. They had been talking, in one form or another, ever since. It was a Tuesday in October when the trouble started, which was, Owen would later note, a deeply unfair day for your life to reorganize itself. Claire had called him at 5:30 while he was running a finishing coat over a rocking chair for a client in Brentwood. The phone was on the bench. He answered it with sawdust on his forearm and the kind of distracted affection that had become, without either of them naming it, their default register. "I have a date tonight," she said. Owen set the cloth down. "Good for you." His name is Daniel. He works in commercial real estate. He wears shirts with the top 2 buttons undone at dinner. That's very specific. I don't know. Kira set it up. You know how Kira is. He did know how Kira was. Kira was Claire's older sister, a woman who had been successfully married for 11 years and had come to believe this qualified her to manage the romantic infrastructure of everyone within a 20-mile radius. She was not malicious. She was the kind of person who genuinely believed that other people's singleness was a problem she could solve with enough scheduling. "Do you want to go?" Owen asked. A pause. "I don't not want to go. That's not an answer. It's the most honest one I have." She was quiet for a second. He could hear her moving around her kitchen, the sound of a mug being set on the counter. "Come with me," she said. "To the restaurant. Not on the date, obviously, just be there, in case it's terrible." "You want me to sit at a different table and monitor your date. I want you to be nearby in case I need rescuing." Owen looked at the rocking chair. He looked at his beer, which had gone warm. He thought about the fact that 3 years ago he had talked to this woman for 4 hours at a barbecue and had never once since then wanted to stop. "Fine," he said. "What time?" The restaurant was called Birchwood, and it had the kind of lighting that was specifically designed to make everything look like a photograph. Low amber, warm wood, candles and small glass holders on every table. Owen arrived 7 minutes before Claire and Daniel and sat at the bar, which gave him a clean sightline to the corner booth without making it obvious. He ordered a beer that arrived in a frosted glass and thought about how he was a 38-year-old man sitting alone at a bar to watch his best friend go on a date, which was a sentence that would take some time to fully examine. Claire came in at 7:15. She was wearing a dark green wrap dress, and her hair was down. He was used to seeing it clipped up badly, a pen sometimes tucked in the knot. And she looked, Owen thought with a kind of unhurried clarity, like the most familiar and unfamiliar thing he had seen in 3 years. She scanned the room and found him at the bar. She gave him a look that communicated approximately 4 separate things in the span of 2 seconds, all of them in a language only the 2 of them spoke. Daniel was behind her by half a step. He was tall, tanned, and wearing exactly the shirt Claire had described. He pulled out his own chair before he pulled out hers, which Owen catalogued and filed without comment. He stayed at the bar. He ordered a second beer he did not particularly want. He watched Daniel lean across the table with the confidence of a man who had been told he was charming so many times he had started to believe it unconditionally. Claire was nodding. She was smiling, but it was the smile she used when she was being polite rather than engaged. Owen knew the difference. He had been on the receiving end of both often enough to have mapped the distinction in considerable detail. 40 minutes in, his phone buzzed. The text read, "He just explained the difference between commercial and residential real estate for 12 minutes. I counted. Owen typed back, "Educational." She sent back a single flat-faced emoji. He was still smiling at his phone when Daniel appeared at the bar beside him. It was not immediately clear whether Daniel recognized Owen from the booth or whether he had simply come for another drink. Owen did not look up right away. He was not performing calm. He was simply calm. "You know, Claire," Daniel said. It was not entirely a question. Owen looked up. "I do. From where?" "From being her friend for 3 years." Daniel studied him the way people study something they have decided to be dismissive of and are looking for the most efficient angle. She mentioned she was close with someone, a furniture guy. The pause was calibrated. "Didn't picture this." Owen took a measured sip of his beer. He set the glass down without rushing. "Didn't picture what exactly?" Daniel's smile arrived with the ease of long practice. "Just that she'd need a babysitter along for moral support." The bartender was wiping glasses at the far end of the bar. Rain had started against the front windows. Quiet, steady, the kind that turns the city outside into a soft amber blur. Owen looked at Daniel with the patience of a man who has heard this kind of joke before and has never once found it as clever as the person telling it believes it to be. "You'll have to speak up," Owen said pleasantly. "She can't hear you from here, but she will in about 40 seconds when she wonders where you went." Daniel held his gaze for a moment. Then he picked up his drink and went back to the booth. Owen did not watch him go. He looked at the rain on the window and felt something settle in his chest. Not satisfaction exactly, but the specific quiet of a man who has said the right thing and does not need anyone else to confirm it. The evening deteriorated from there by degrees. He heard it the way you hear something you were not supposed to, not from across the room, but because Claire had come to the bar for a glass of water and Daniel had followed her, and the conversation had the tight, low frequency of two people who have moved past pleasantries into something they should have saved for the drive home. Daniel was saying, with the smooth reasonableness of a man who believed reasonableness was a weapon, that he was not looking for anything serious and that Kira had perhaps oversold the situation and that Claire was obviously great, but that he had an arrangement with someone else that was not entirely resolved. Claire had her glass of water in her hand. She was not visibly upset. She had the composed expression of a woman who had seen this particular species of conversation before and had already decided not to give it the dignity of a reaction. Owen was 2 seats away, and he did not move. What Daniel said next was quiet enough that Owen would reconstruct it afterward rather than quote it precisely. Something about her being a solid backup, about how these things sometimes worked out in unexpected directions, about how she should not take it personally. The glass in Claire's hand did not waver, but Owen set his beer down. He turned on the bar stool and looked at Daniel and said, with no particular inflection, "I'm going to take mine home, if that's all right with you." The word arrived before Owen had any clear intention of using it. It simply came out, unhurried and plain, the way true things sometimes do when you have spent 3 years carefully not saying them. Daniel looked at him. Claire looked at him. The bartender, to his credit, continued wiping glasses. "You're—" Daniel started. "My friend," Owen said, "who you just described as a backup plan. We're leaving." He looked at Claire. Her expression was doing something complicated and careful that he could not fully read. He stood up from the bar stool. He left 2 20s on the bar. He held out his jacket because it was raining and she had not brought one. She took it. She did not correct the word. They walked out into the rain on Birchwood Street with the jacket over her shoulders and the amber light from the restaurant windows behind them, and they said nothing for approximately 1 full block, which, in Owen's experience, was either the silence of something ending or the silence of something beginning, and the only way to find out was to keep walking. "Mine," Claire said finally. Owen kept his eyes on the wet pavement. "I know. You said mine. I heard myself." She stopped walking. He stopped a half step later and turned. The rain was fine and cold, and the streetlight caught it at an angle that turned the whole street into something quiet and specific. She was looking at him with the careful attention of a woman running through a long mental inventory and arriving at a conclusion she had perhaps been arriving at for some time. "How long?" she asked. He thought about the honest answer. He thought about the rocking chair on his workbench and the texts at 11 in the evening and the 4 hours at the barbecue, and the way her voice sounded on the phone when a deadline had broken something in her day, and she needed exactly 20 minutes of being heard before she could fix it herself. "Longer than I've been comfortable with," he said. She looked at him for another moment. Then she said quietly and without drama, You are the least surprising surprise I have ever had." He did not fully know what to do with that. He was fairly certain, from the way she said it, that it was not a complaint. They walked to his truck and he drove her home through the rain-slicked streets with the radio on low and her looking out the passenger window the way she did when she was thinking through something that mattered. He did not push. He was not a man who pushed. He was a man who measured the wood carefully before he cut it. And this was not a different situation. At her curb she sat for a moment before she opened the door. The rain had slowed to almost nothing. A street lamp 2 houses down cast a yellow circle on the wet road. "I need to think," she said. "I know. Not because I'm unsure, because I want to be careful. With this." He looked at her. She was already looking back. "So do I," he said. She got out of the truck. She paused at the door and looked back in at him with his jacket still over her arm. "I'd love that," she said softly. "For the record, whatever that looks like." She went inside. The door closed. Owen sat in the dark for a moment with the radio on low and the rain tapping the roof in a light, uneven rhythm, and he felt something that he did not immediately have a word for. Not relief exactly, not joy, but the specific warmth of a room that has been drafty for 3 years and has, without announcement, finally sealed. He drove home on quiet streets. He did not sleep immediately. He sat in the garage with the linseed oil smell and the rocking chair and a beer that he actually finished, and he thought about the word mine and how it had been sitting in him for 3 years without a door, and how the strangest things find their way out when someone who doesn't deserve to is careless enough to leave one open. Kira called him 2 days later. He had been half expecting it. Kira was not a person who let significant events pass without a processing period. "I heard what happened," she said. "I took my friend home," Owen said, "in the rain." A pause. Then her voice shifted. Less managing, more sincere. "I've been setting her up with people for 2 years because I didn't think you were going to say anything." He was quiet. "I'm not angry. I just want to know that this is real." "So do I," he said. "That's why I'm being careful." He heard her exhale. "Then be careful," she said, "but not too careful. She's been waiting longer than you think." He sat with that for the rest of the afternoon. Claire came by the garage on Thursday with 2 coffees and no particular agenda, which was how she had always come by and which now felt entirely different in the specific way that something familiar can look new when you have finally admitted what it means. She sat on the wooden stool by the workbench while he finished the rocking chair's final coat, and they talked the way they always talked, about her deadline, about a client who wanted an oak dining set refinished in a color he described as farmhouse gray, which Owen had spent 20 minutes explaining was not a real color. She laughed. He watched her laugh and thought about the paint on her sleeve that first night and the flat-faced emoji and the way she had taken his jacket without correcting the word, and he felt the patience of a man who has decided he would rather do this correctly than quickly. She set her coffee down and looked at the rocking chair. She ran one finger along the curved armrest. "It's beautiful," she said. "Needed work," he said. "Most good things do." She looked at him. He held her gaze without rushing anything. "Are you trying not to say something?" she asked. "No," he said. "I'm trying to say it correctly." She slid off the stool and stood close enough that he could smell the coffee and the faint cedar that had gotten into everything in this space, including, he supposed, her. She looked up at him with the particular attentiveness that meant she was not going anywhere. "I'm not made of glass," she said, "in case that's the thing stopping you." It was not a line he had been expecting, and it was, he realized, exactly what he needed to hear. He reached out and tucked a loose piece of hair back behind her ear with the same deliberate care he gave every piece of wood that came through his shop, the understanding that some things have been waiting a long time and deserve to be handled well. Then he kissed her. Quietly, without drama, the way true things happen when they have been true for a long time already. She pulled back and looked at him with something that was not surprise exactly, more like confirmation. "Finally," she said. He almost laughed. He did not. He said, "I know." And she leaned her head briefly against his shoulder, and the garage was warm and smelled like cedar and coffee, and the radio was playing something low from the bench, and it was, by any measure, a very ordinary Thursday. They were not particularly dramatic about it after that. They did not announce anything. They simply continued being in each other's lives in the same way they always had been, except now when she sat on the stool in the garage she sometimes stayed for dinner, and when he drove her home he came inside, and the thing that had been a draft in the room was a fire instead. 6 months later, on a Sunday morning in April, with coffee and mismatched mugs and her cross-legged on his kitchen counter going through a client brief and him making eggs, she looked up and said, "I've been thinking about the spare room." He looked at her. "What about it?" "Whether it would fit my drafting table." He flipped the eggs. He looked out the window at the yard where the grass had just started coming back in after winter. He thought about the rocking chair, which had been delivered to its client in Brentwood and replaced on his bench by a cedar chest with a broken hinge. He thought about backup plans and open loops and words that come out before you have decided to say them. "It would fit," he said. She nodded, unsurprised, and went back to her brief. He set a plate beside her on the counter. She picked up her fork without looking up. It was almost exactly a year later, on a Wednesday evening with the fire going in the backyard pit and string lights strung between the fence posts and a beer bottle sweating on the metal table between them, that he proposed. He did not make it complicated. He had the ring in the pocket of his jacket, the one she had walked out of the restaurant in, which she had never fully returned and which he had never fully asked for back. He took it out and set it on the table between them and said, "You know what I'm asking?" She looked at it. She looked at him. Something settled in her expression. Not surprise, not performance, just the quiet recognition of a woman who has known something for a long time and is glad to finally have it confirmed. "I know what you're asking," she said. "And?" "And I'd love that," she said. The same words, the same register. He felt the callback land all the way down. She leaned across the table and kissed him once, and the fire crackled, and the string lights were yellow and warm above them, and somewhere down the street a lawn mower was finishing its last pass for the evening, and everything was, as far as Owen was concerned, exactly right. He thought sometimes about the word mine, how it had come out of him in a bar on a rainy Tuesday in October with no plan behind it, no strategy, just the pressure of someone being careless with someone he valued. How it had been the most accurate thing he had said in 3 years. How sometimes the truest sentences are the ones you say before you have decided whether you are allowed to. He thought about how she had never corrected it. He decided that was the whole story, really.